Hey guys, tonight we drift together into the quiet life of a 19th century Bedouin storyteller. You trudge across dunes that ripple like golden oceans under the first timid light, each grain warming beneath your bare feet, carrying the faint tang of earth and a hint of camel sweat. The sun teases the horizon, painting shadows that stretch long and thin, almost like the silhouettes of dancing spirits. You probably won't survive this long walk if you're imagining it in stilettos or loafers. So it's just you, the sand, and the slow rise of dawn. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's fun to see where this little shared story reaches. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pause at the crest of a small dune, inhaling the dry perfume of desert air that carries faint traces of distant dates, camels, and the unmistakable warmth of baked sand. The wind is playful, nudging loose grains into a shimmering veil that makes the horizon blur in gentle waves. A lone hawk circles above, indifferent, yet somehow part of this living tapestry. You notice how your shadow stretches long behind you, and you remember a curious fringe tale your grandfather once murmured, that if your shadow touched a dune at sunrise, it meant you'd carry the day's stories safely to others. Historians still argue whether such superstitions were practical survival tools or whimsical narrative embellishments. But for you, they add a comforting rhythm to the waking world. You adjust your scarf to shield your face from the early glare, feeling the soft, scratchy sand slip through your fingers as you brush against it absent-mindedly. Your camels are stirring somewhere behind you. Low humming sounds like distant drums vibrating through the still morning. Each movement is purposeful, graceful, despite the heat that already promises an unrelenting day. You think about how Bedouins historically relied on precise knowledge of terrain and animal behavior to navigate these vast spaces. It's a fact that still astonishes outsiders who imagine the desert as endless and chaotic. But you know better. Every dune has its memory. Every wind pattern a language if you listen closely enough. In the hush of this golden dawn, you notice tiny footprints, the passing of desert mice, perhaps, or the scuttle of a beetle. It's almost meditative, each soft imprint a punctuation in the vast, unending paragraph of sand. You recall reading that some travelers considered the Bedouin morning ritual to be the most peaceful moment of the day. A fragile pause before the sun's fury and the endless responsibilities of tribe, travel, and storytelling. You lift your gaze and spot the first gleam of a distant oasis. Palms huddled together like old friends, sharing secrets. You quicken your step slightly, not out of urgency, but from the subtle excitement that a day of stories is beginning, waiting to be plucked from memory and whispered into the ears of listeners, yet unseen. As you approach, the sun slides higher, brushing warm fingers over the sand and bathing everything in a soft, honeyed glow. You bend to touch a rough stone, noticing the sharp contrast between its hardness and the yielding dunes. A subtle reminder that even in a world dominated by sand, permanence exists in small, patient places. A passing wind carries the scent of distant spices, perhaps cardamom or dates, teasing your senses and coaxing memories of early meals before long treks. A fringe anecdote floats through your mind, that Bedouin storytellers sometimes used aromatic hints in the air to trigger memories for their listeners, enhancing the drama of each tale. Scholars still argue whether such methods were common or merely anecdotal eccentricities. But it's a practice you find charming enough to imagine yourself trying. Your steps slow, allowing the morning to unfold around you. The desert is alive in quiet ways. A breeze rattles the palm fronds. A lone fox trots in the distance, and somewhere behind a ridge, the sound of a hidden spring murmurs like a secret lullaby. You think about how sunrise has always been a universal signal of beginnings. But here, it feels intimate, personalized, almost conspiratorial. You feel the grains under your feet crunch softly, as if the sand itself were an accomplice in today's storytelling, ready to absorb every word you will eventually share with your circle. You glance back once more, taking in the vast sweep of dunes, the gentle curl of shadows, and the faint shimmer of morning mirages. Even the heat, which promises to rise mercilessly, feels oddly comforting, a reminder that the desert is not just a setting, but a living partner in your day, responsive and patient. Your shadow stretches long and thin again, almost like an escort guiding you toward the oasis. And you can't help but smile at the thought that centuries of Bedouins have walked these same steps, whispering stories into dawn's quiet embrace. By the time you reach the first cluster of palms, the sun is fully awake, casting a warm glow over the shallow water that ripples with gentle life. Dragonflies flit across the surface, and small fish scatter in delicate flashes of silver. You kneel, cupping water to your lips, the chill a shock against the already rising heat. You savor the taste, clean and fleeting, and marvel at how such simple things, sand, water, wind, compose the stage for your day, a stage older than any stone building, any written record. Historians still argue whether early Bedouins intentionally cultivated oasis spots as communal gathering spaces, or if usage emerged naturally. But you know that the effect is the same. It's a place to pause, to breathe, to listen, and to begin telling stories. As the sun climbs higher, casting its warming gaze across the dunes, you straighten, brushing the sand from your robe, feeling ready to meet whatever wandering listeners might arrive. You take a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the dry, warm, fragrant air that smells of earth and possibility, letting the quiet morning settle into your bones. You feel a gentle thrill, a private acknowledgement that this is your world, your rhythm. Dawn over the endless sand, a horizon that promises stories, and the patient companionship of time itself. The oasis hums with subtle life as you begin your morning rituals. You kneel by the water, letting the cool liquid slide over your hands, a small shock against the warmth seeping into your skin from the dunes. You draw a deep breath, feeling the air carry faint traces of jasmine and date palms, a scent that somehow promises both alertness and tranquility at once. A gentle breeze rustles through the fronds overhead, making a soft, rhythmic whisper, almost like an audience settling in to listen. You pour water into a small metal pot and place it over a fire you've carefully coaxed to life with flint. Mindful of not letting the flames climb to hyacinth, is patient, but fire has a short temper. Historians still argue whether Bedouins primarily used metal or ceramic vessels in daily routines during this period. But the cool gleam of your pot seems timeless, a bridge between practical survival and ritualized care. As the coffee begins to bubble, its earthy aroma rising into the soft morning air, you prepare small arrangements of dates, some salted, some honeyed, aligning them in neat rows on a low woven mat. You like this act. It grounds you before the day's wandering and storytelling. The contrast between the bitter, strong coffee and the sweet, soft dates mirrors life in the desert itself, hard and unyielding, yet punctuated by moments of unexpected delight. You chuckle softly, thinking how anyone unfamiliar with Bedouin life might find your ritual odd. Brewing coffee over a crackling fire in the sand. But here, it's as ordinary as the dunes stretching endlessly in every direction. A fringe notion floats to mind, that certain tribes believe the aroma of coffee could ward off spirits lingering in early daylight. Whether myth or serious precaution, you allow yourself the indulgence of imagining small, invisible listeners hovering near, waiting for their share of the morning ritual. You lift a cup of the steaming brew, inhaling the scent before the first tentative sip. It's bitter, yes, but invigorating, and the taste anchors you to this moment, to this small oasis tucked like a secret within the vast desert. Around you, dragonflies hover above the water, dipping to touch its surface as if to test the morning. A lizard darts across sun-warmed stone, pausing to blink at your presence, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared space. You reflect on how historians describe such mornings as essential for Bedouin well-being. A pause. A ritualized centering, where water, food, and quiet conspire to ready mind and body for the long day ahead. Still, you sometimes wonder if they miss the poetry of it, the way the golden light glints off each droplet. The way a breeze can transform simple coffee into a fleeting celebration of life. You arrange a small circle of mats beneath the nearest palm, adjusting them for shade, and the low hum of the oasis settles around you. In these quiet moments, you feel the weight of memory and tradition pressing gently, like an invisible hand guiding your movements. Scholars still argue whether these morning routines were strictly functional or carried layered symbolic meaning. For you, the distinction is unimportant because both pulse through the rhythm of your body. The subtle choreography of action and anticipation. You sip coffee again, letting the warmth seep through your chest, and smile at the thought that these simple, axe-boring, stirring, arranging serve as the opening notes for the day's narrative symphony. The breeze shifts slightly, carrying with it faint traces of distant camps, perhaps a caravan stirring beyond the dunes. You tilt your head, listening to the soft rustle of palm fronds, the delicate splash of water against stone, the distant rattle of camel bells. It is as though the desert itself participates in your storytelling, a silent orchestra tuning in anticipation. You notice a single small bird alight on a nearby branch, chirping softly, punctuating the scene like punctuation in a sentence. Fringe lore suggests that birds sometimes carry messages from far-off travelers, though historians debate whether this was practical belief or poetic license. Regardless, you feel a small thrill imagining your morning companions, human or otherwise, gathering invisibly to witness the unfolding day. You pour another cup of coffee, this one slightly cooler, savoring the bitter sweetness while arranging additional dates on the mat. You pause, rubbing your hands together to disperse residual warmth from the morning sun. The sand beneath your knees is soft but firm, yielding just enough to remind you of the desert's presence. You trace a small circle in the sand with your finger, watching tiny grains tumble like miniature hourglasses, and consider how time itself seems to stretch and condense here, unhurried yet inevitable. You recall a fringe tale suggesting that Bedouins sometimes interpreted the patterns of fallen sand as messages or omens. Scholars still debate the prevalence of such practices, but you appreciate the poetic charm. Imagining your mat of dates as a stage in each grain of sand, a tiny actor in the morning's drama. As the sun climbs higher, you finish preparing your coffee, the dark liquid now shimmering in the gentle light. You breathe deeply, feeling warmth seep into your limbs, calming yet energizing, and settle back slightly on your mat. Around you, the oasis continues its quiet symphony, a soft ripple of water, the faint rustle of palms, the distant echo of camel steps. You sip coffee again, enjoying the contrast between its heat and the fresh morning air. And you wonder how many centuries of storytellers have performed this same ritual, offering sustenance to themselves and their companions before tales took flight. Historians still argue whether morning routines across desert tribes were highly standardized or varied significantly between clans, but it hardly matters to you. This rhythm is yours, and it hums gently through every gesture. You glance around, imagining how you will share these small, grounding details with anyone who joins you later. The simple acts of brewing, arranging, and tasting the quiet contemplation of wind, water, and sunlight set the tone for storytelling, creating a space of trust, comfort, and shared attention. Even as you sip, you notice a tiny beetle scuttling across the sand, pausing briefly as if to observe your work. Fringe anecdotes suggest insects sometimes served as reminders of hidden energies or spirits. A playful concept you smile at without needing proof. Scholars still debate whether such beliefs were widely held or purely local eccentricities, but you let it linger in your imagination, a tiny spark of wonder. Finally, you rise slowly, brushing off sand, adjusting robes and savoring the last traces of coffee warmth in your hands. The mats are ready, the oasis alive with quiet energy, and you feel the subtle anticipation of gathering stories, welcoming travelers and weaving tales that stretch back through generations. Morning rituals complete, you take one last look at the gentle shimmer of palms reflected in the water, the soft ripples catching sunlight in fleeting patterns. It is a pause, a preparation, and an intimate prelude to the day's unfolding. And you step forward with a quiet smile, knowing that the desert waits, patient and expectant, as always. You mount your camels as the morning heat begins to press more insistently against the sand. Their soft hums and shifting weight are comforting, a familiar rhythm that anchors you as the desert stretches endlessly ahead. You brush your hand along the coarse fur of your led camel, feeling the subtle warmth and texture. And notice how each animal has its own stubborn personality. One tilts its head suspiciously at a distant dune, while another nudges impatiently, eager to resume the slow march. Historians still argue whether Bedouin camel training methods were formalized or largely intuitive, passed down through observation and gentle correction. You, of course, know both approaches coexist. Discipline tempered with understanding, patience measured against necessity. As you guide your small caravan along the undulating dunes, you take a moment to notice the subtleties of their movements. The way the led camel's knees sink slightly into soft sand, how the reins shift under gentle pressure, and the faint click of hooves over hidden stones. These animals are companions as much as transport, and in this quiet morning, you appreciate their presence more than any words could convey. A fringe story drifts into your memory, that some desert nomads believed camels could sense the storyteller smooth, adjusting their pace and temperament accordingly. It seems improbable, perhaps, but observing their behavior makes you wonder if there is a grain of truth hidden in legend. You navigate through a narrow pass, where the dunes curve sharply like waves frozen mid-crest. The wind carries a faint scent of distant sage and warmed earth, mingling with the ever-present aroma of camel fur and coffee from the oasis behind you. The shifting patterns of sunlight and shadow create a living mosaic across the sand, and you realize the desert is never static. It is a constantly rearranging theater, responding to sun, wind, and the slow passage of creatures. You can almost hear the faint chorus of sand grains rolling over one another, a quiet percussion accompanying your journey. Scholars still argue whether the desert's natural rhythms dictated Bedouin movement patterns or whether human ingenuity imposed its own order onto the landscape, and you decide to enjoy the ambiguity. Your camels pause briefly at a slight rise, heads dipping to nibble on sparse desert shrubs. You take the moment to stretch, letting your fingers trace patterns in the sand, remembering the early tales of merchants who once traversed these routes. Some of these stories speak of miraculous survival, while others hint at fantastical encounters with spirits or trickster animals. Fringe scholars suggest Bedouins sometimes exaggerated these tales to entertain or teach practical lessons. A duality you find endlessly charming. You laugh quietly at the thought, imagining a camel rolling its eyes at exaggerated human storytelling, though it would probably never admit it. You continue your trek, adjusting your pace to match the lead camel, feeling the sway and gentle jolt with each step. Your shadow stretches behind you, long and thin in the strengthening light, and you wonder whether travelers from centuries ago recognized the same interplay of light and terrain, drawing stories from its patterns. One particular dune rises sharply, almost defiantly, demanding careful navigation. You lean forward, whispering a soft word of encouragement to your camel, who responds with a patient, measured step. Historians still argue whether such careful attention to subtle animal behavior was instinctual or taught through meticulous apprenticeship. But your experience tells you it is a delicate balance of both. The desert hums around you, the soft scrape of sand beneath hooves, the low whisper of the wind against dunes, the occasional distant call of a desert bird. You notice how light refracts across the mirages ahead, subtle waves that shimmer like liquid heat, teasing your eyes into imagining distant water or an oasis that isn't there. You remember a fringe tale about desert mirages being illusions created by spirits to test travelers' patience and resolve. Whether metaphor or folklore, it resonates with you now, reminding you to appreciate each small reality as it presents itself rather than chasing impossible visions. You shift your weight slightly, adjusting to the camel's gait, feeling grounded in the tangible world of sand, sweat, and steady breath. As you crest a larger dune, the horizon opens up, revealing the vast expanse of undulating sand stretching toward a faint ridge in the distance. The sheer scale of it always humbles you. You take a moment to let your gaze wander, letting the sense of openness sink deep into your chest. The heat begins to rise more insistently, curling in waves across the sand like invisible serpents. But the camel's calm persistence and the rhythm of your own breathing create a gentle counterpoint. You recall historical accounts describing Bedouins' acute ability to read terrain and weather from subtle cues, a skill that outsiders often underestimated. You smile, realizing that centuries of learned attention manifest in these small, conscious moments of survival and harmony. Your journey leads you past a sparse patch of desert flowers, resilient stems pushing up from sand in defiance of heat and dryness. You pause, letting the camels graze lightly, watching how their movements disturb tiny clouds of dust that dance briefly in the air. The simplicity of the scene is mesmerizing, almost meditative. Fringe beliefs hold that noticing such small bursts of life in the desert was thought to invite good fortune, a symbolic acknowledgement of endurance in an unforgiving world. You can see why. Even the tiniest blossoms remind you of resilience, of quiet persistence that mirrors your own slow rhythm across the dunes. You continue onward, the desert folding around you in waves of gold and ochre. Each dune holds subtle differences, a slightly sharper curve, a faint shadow marking a hidden hollow, a thin line of hardened earth signaling past water. You note these details unconsciously, as any seasoned storyteller would, storing them as settings and textures for tales you will later weave into the narrative. You smile at the thought that each camel, each breeze, each shifting shadow is a collaborator in your storytelling, an active participant in a living theater. Historians still argue whether the importance of these observations was primarily practical or imbued with aesthetic appreciation, but for you, there is no separation. Utility and beauty coexist effortlessly. By mid-morning, you approach a plateau where the sand smooths into a subtle, golden plain. The camel's pace slows naturally, and you notice the small beads of sweat forming along your hairline. You pause to drink from your water skin, savoring the brief coolness, the momentary relief. The horizon shimmers faintly with heat waves, and in that shimmer, you allow your imagination to drift slightly, conjuring stories of travelers from long ago, merchants, wanderers, perhaps even spirits disguised as distant dunes. Fringe tales suggest that those who observe carefully can glimpse echoes of past travelers in the sands, though historians debate whether these notions reflect practical observation or imaginative storytelling. You sip again, enjoying the interplay between history and myth, fact and fancy. As you guide your caravan further, you think about the relationships between humans and animals in this harsh environment. Camels are more than transport. They are companions, confidants, and sometimes even silent critics of your storytelling patience. You remember a story of a camel that refused to move until its rider recited a familiar poem, a tale that historians still debate as true event versus fanciful narrative. Either way, it underscores the subtle interplay of trust, attention, and ritual that shapes life in the desert. You glance at your own camels and smile, wondering what stories they might tell if only they could speak. The afternoon sun grows warmer, and you feel the subtle shift from gentle morning to steady heat. You adjust your reins, glancing across the dunes where mirages shimmer faintly. You think about the enduring patience required for this life, navigating terrain, reading animals, interpreting subtle environmental causal, while keeping stories alive in your own mind, ready for the ears of travelers you may meet later. Each step, each sway of the camel, each grain of sand contributes to the rhythm, the continuity of existence, and the narrative that binds past, present, and future. You inhale deeply, letting the warmth settle, and push forward, steady and unhurried, as the desert stretches endlessly before you. You reach the lone acacia tree before the heat grows harsh, its wide branches offering shade that spills across the sand like a generous cloak. You dismount with a gentle stretch, the stiffness of camel travel still buzzing through your legs. The camels grunt softly, relieved to kneel and rest, their shadows pooling long and dark under the mid-morning sun. You pat their sides as if thanking them, then step beneath the acacia where the air feels just a little cooler. The kind of difference only someone who spends days in the desert can fully appreciate. Here you begin to arrange the story circle mats, placed carefully in a ring-low cushion set, where the best breeze might catch and a small space. In the center left for the inevitable kettle of tea or coffee that anchors any gathering. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were deliberate social designs or simply practical ways of sitting, but for you, it's a choreography of comfort and anticipation. You smooth one mat with the palm of your hand, brushing sand away in neat strokes. And you smile to yourself at the thought of who might appear. Travelers, traders, wanderers all drawn by the promise of shade, a sip of water, and a story to lighten the heat. You hear the faint jingle of bells in the distance and tilt your head. Perhaps a caravan approaches, perhaps only your imagination echoing back. The desert has a way of making even silence sound full of possibility. A fringed tale comes to mind. Some claimed the acacia tree itself could call to wanderers, whispering through the rustling leaves to beckon them into its shade. Historians dismiss this as romantic invention, but as the wind shifts, you allow yourself a sly grin. Maybe the tree is whispering right now. You place a small basket of dates in the center of the circle, their glossy skins catching the dappled light that filters through branches above. Next to them, a shallow clay dish of salt glimmers faintly, a reminder of hospitality and survival. You know the ritual. Offer sweetness, balance it with salt, and make guests feel that even the desert itself has softened for their visit. You set the kettle to heat, the faint smoke curling upward like an invitation banner. Already, you can sense the space transforming, not just a patch of shade, but a stage. Scholars still argue whether storytelling circles served primarily as entertainment, or as vehicles for teaching and preserving culture. Sitting here, arranging the details with quiet intention, you know both answers hold truth. The first guests appear, pair of merchants, their robes dusty, their eyes bright with travel. They approach with a cautious wave, as if unsure whether they are intruding, but you rise with an easy smile and gesture toward the mats. They accept gratefully, sinking into the cushions with audible sighs of relief. Their camels join yours in the shade, animals recognizing each other with low, throaty murmurs. The merchants lean back, letting the breeze stir their robes, and their faces soften in the comfort of rest. You pour them each a cup of coffee, dark and steaming, and place a small pile of dates beside them. They nod in gratitude, their silence speaking more than any words. Soon, a small family arrives, parents with 2 children tugging excitedly at their sleeves. The children dart immediately to the mats, laughing as they flop down in exaggerated exhaustion. You hand them dates, and their eyes brighten at the sweetness. The parents smile at you, lines of fatigue easing as they lower themselves into the circle. You notice how the gathering takes shape naturally, each arrival filling a gap, each mat gaining a presence. The space hums with quiet conversation, soft greetings, and the faint anticipation of story. Fringe lore suggests that acacia trees were sometimes believed to host unseen spirits who joined circles unseen, adding their laughter or sighs to the group. Whether true or not, you sense the gathering growing larger than the sum of its visible parts. The kettle whistles faintly, signaling readiness, and you pour steaming tea this time, strong and sharp with cardamom. The fragrance fills the shade, mingling with the earthy scent of sand and tree bark. Cups are passed, dates are shared, and already the group begins to relax into the rhythm of community. You feel the weight of expectations settle gently, not as pressure, but as invitation. You are the storyteller, and the circle is your canvas. Historians still argue whether oral storytelling preserved factual memory or simply entertained. But you know the truth is, both your role is not just to recount, but to make people feel, to give shape to the desert's silence. You clear your throat lightly, the universal signal of a story about to begin, and the children hush almost instantly. Even the merchants lean forward, their eyes gleaming with curiosity. You let the pause linger, enjoying the suspense, then begin with a simple phrase. One that all Bedouin ears recognize. Once, in the time before the dunes knew their shapes. The listeners straighten, their attention captured as the rhythm of words pulls them into your weaving. You tell of travelers who walked so far that their shadows grew tired before they did. Of a fox who tricked the desert wind into blowing backward. Of a well so deep it touched the stars. The circle listens with open faces, smiles flickering, eyes wide, sighs escaping in unison. You weave fact and fancy seamlessly, speaking of real wells dug centuries ago, mixing them with tales of spirits who guarded them jealously. Scholars still debate whether such blending of truth and myth was deliberate education or simply a creative habit. But in the faces of your listeners, you see the effect. Curiosity, amusement, a spark of wonder. The children laugh at the fox's cleverness. The merchants nod knowingly at mentions of old trade routes. And the parents exchange glances at the familiar moral threads tucked into your tales. Even the camels seem to settle. They're chewing quieter, as though reluctant to disturb the flow. You pause occasionally to sip tea, letting the story breathe, letting the listeners lean closer, eager for more. You tease them lightly with raised eyebrows or a playful shrug, as if debating whether to continue, and their protests fuel your next words. The laughter, the sighs, the collective leaning forward, it is all part of the rhythm. The dance between teller and audience. A fringe belief whispers through your mind that stories themselves had spirits, choosing storytellers as vessels. Whether true or poetic, you feel the presence of something beyond yourself, something that animates your voice and binds this circle together. By the time the story concludes with the fox tricking even the stars into winking, the sun has shifted slightly, and the shade has shortened. Yet no one moves to leave. They sit in the lingering silence, the shared warmth of words still vibrating like a low chord in the air. You smile softly, offering another round of tea, and the merchants exchange a glance before settling back, clearly eager for another tale. The children whisper excitedly, trying to guess what might come next, while their parents chuckle, shaking their heads indulgently. The circle has formed fully now, not just of bodies, but of hearts, all bound by the threads of story under the patient branches of the acacia. The sun climbs higher, and the shade beneath the acacia tree shrinks little by little, but your circle of listeners remains intact, their eyes bright with expectation. You lean back against your cushion, squinting upward at the vast sky. The desert is always sky first, sand second, an endless canvas of light. You stretch out a hand, tracing invisible lines between points of pale blue that by nightfall will sparkle into constellations. Already you feel the pull of those stories waiting above, and you let your voice drift toward them. You see, you murmur to the circle. The desert has two companions, the sand beneath your feet and the stars above your head. One tells you where you are, the other tells you where you are going. The merchants nod knowingly. Travelers are always hungry for such connections. The children crane their necks upward as if expecting to see stars in daylight, squinting at the empty blue. You chuckle softly and add, "Don't worry, they're shy for now. But tonight, they'll strut across the sky as if the desert were their private stage." Historians still argue whether Bedouin navigators relied primarily on the stars or on terrain cues like wind-shaped dunes. You, however, know both truths hold. The stars offer direction when the land feels endless, but the land offers survival when clouds hide the night. You tell the circle how ancient caravans learned to read the glittering sky, how the North Star became a loyal friend, and how constellations carried not only guidance but stories woven from ancestors' voices. You shift your hand, drawing an imaginary pattern in the air. This one, you say, is Suhatha star you call Canopus. When it rises, the heat begins to fade, and you know the seasons are turning. The parents exchange a glance, murmuring agreement. The merchants smile, clearly familiar with the name. The children, though, only gape, waiting for the twist that turns fact into fable. And you oblige them. But Suhail, you add with a conspiratorial grin, was once a stubborn wanderer who refused to share his tent. So the heavens banished him far to the south, where he broods alone. Look for him when the air cools, you might hear him muttering. The children burst into laughter, while even the camels flick their ears as though unimpressed by Suhail's bad manners. A fringed tale comes to mind. Some storytellers insisted that the Milky Way was the trail of spilled flour from a giant sack, guiding lost travelers toward food. Historians dismiss it as simple metaphor, yet you suspect there's deeper playfulness in such explanations. After all, why not make the sky a kitchen when hunger often accompanies travel? You sip from your cup, the tea now lukewarm, and continue. See, every star is both a map and a joke. The heavens guide you, but they also tease you. You follow Orion, but what if Orion decides to trip over his own belt? Then you're lost and forced to ask a camel for directions. The merchants laugh at this, shaking their heads at the idea of taking instructions from beasts, though you notice one of them glance at his camel with mock suspicion. The children repeat the joke eagerly, as though it might gain more sparkle each time. As the shade shortens, you rise briefly to adjust the mats, shifting them closer to the trunk of the acacia. The group follows your lead, resettling in the cooler spots. You sit again, lowering your voice slightly, creating intimacy. The desert nights are never silent. While you gaze at stars, you'll hear the whispers of wind, the crackle of fire, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, the groan of shifting dunes. You let the words hang, letting listeners imagine. Some say these sounds are simply the work of wind and sand, but others, you pause dramatically, believe they're the voices of those who never reach the next oasis. The circle shivers in unison, even in the midday heat. The children lean closer, wide-eyed. The parents glance at each other with half smiles, not quite sure whether to laugh or hush their little ones. Scholars still debate whether Bedouins genuinely believed dunes could echo the dead, or if it was simply a cautionary tale to keep wanderers alert at night. You shrug, offering no resolution, because uncertainty is its own kind of story. To soften the tension, you point again at the invisible stars above. Of course, not all tales are warnings. Some are lullabies. See the cluster you'll later know as the Pleiades. In our stories, they're sisters who sang travelers to sleep, their voices carried on the night wind. If you hear humming while you drift off, maybe don't panic. It could just be 7 sisters giving you a bedtime song. The children smile dreamily, already trying to imagine the tune. You lean back once more, closing your eyes for a moment, listening to the rustle of acacia leaves. The desert offers sound in small doses, like a careful storyteller rationing words. You reopen your eyes, catching the gleam of anticipation still alive in your circle. The stars are gossipers, you add casually. They've been shining for centuries, so of course they whisper about everyone who passes. If you think you can walk the desert without being noticed, well, good luck. Somewhere up there, a star is telling another star about your crooked turban or the way you snore. The merchants chuckle knowingly, while one of the parents hides a grin behind a sip of tea. A breeze stirs, carrying the faint scent of dust and blossoms. And you let your words settle into the silence, giving space for reflection. This rhythm fact, woven with fancy cosmic maps, stitched with human quirks, is your way of connecting the circle to the vastness above them. You think of how, for centuries, storytellers sat just like this, under acacia or palm, turning constellations into companions. Historians still argue whether these myths were primarily educational tools or communal entertainment. You suspect the answer is neither and both. The stars themselves are storytellers, and you merely echo their voices. The children, restless now, beg for another sky story. You oblige with a quick one about a lizard who raced the moon across the dunes, only to lose because he stopped to snack on beetles. Moral, you ask, raising your eyebrows? One of the merchants answers dryly, "Never underestimate hunger," and the group bursts into laughter. The children giggle uncontrollably, repeating "snacking lizard," until even the camels glance over with something like disapproval. You sense the sun tilting past its peak, the air thickening with heat, and you know the circle will soon scatter for rest before gathering again later. But before the group disperses, you offer one last thought. Tonight, when the sky opens its door, don't just see stars as dots of light. See them as stories guides, pranksters, lullaby singers. They're as restless as the desert and just as patient. If you listen closely, you might even hear them laughing at us. The group lingers on your words, nodding slowly, savoring the mixture of comfort and curiosity. The merchants glance skyward again, perhaps imagining their night journey guided by Suhail. The children lie flat on their backs, staring at the empty blue, waiting for stars that won't appear until evening. And you, sitting cross-legged under the acacia, feel the desert tighten its circle around you. Sand below, sky above, stories weaving through both. The afternoon slides slowly across the desert, and the acacia's shadow stretches like a lazy arm across the sand. The heat presses heavy on your shoulders, and yet the circle lingers, unwilling to scatter completely. Someone passes you a clay bowl of dates, sticky with sugar and sunlight. You pop one into your mouth and let the sweetness melt, cutting through the dryness of tea and dust. Dates are more than food, out here they're survival. You remind your listeners of that fact, saying, "These little things might look like candy, but trust me, they've saved more caravans than swords ever have." It's true. Mainstream historians note that dates were the backbone of Bedouin survival, a crop so reliable it shaped trade routes and diet. A single palm could feed families, pack saddles, and even offer shelter with its leaves. You toss a pit back into the bowl and add, "Without dates, half the tales I tell you wouldn't exist, because their heroes would have fainted of hunger halfway through." That earns a ripple of laughter. Though one merchant mutters about figs being superior, sparking a playful argument. You settle it by declaring, "Figs may be noble, but dates are the desert's comedians." They're wrinkled, sticky, and still everyone loves them. You let the sweetness soften your voice as you slip into another layer of story. Once, you begin. A young traveler lost his way among the dunes. He carried nothing but a pouch of dates. Each time he thought he was finished, he found one more clinging stubbornly to the bottom. Some say the desert itself kept refilling the pouch, amused by his stubbornness. Others say he just had poor eyesight. Either way, he reached the next well alive, and probably a little tired of dates. The children laugh, nudging each other, while one merchant holds his pouch a little closer, as if it might sprout miracles of its own. Historians still argue whether such tales of miraculous food were meant as moral lessons or simple entertainment. You lean into the debate by suggesting, maybe the story just says what we all know. When you're hungry, even the smallest bite becomes a feast. Survival is sometimes just tricking your stomach into thinking it's lucky. The circle nods, and the parents pass dates to the children, who smear their fingers and giggle at the stickiness. You shift, stretching your legs in the sand, and draw a small circle with your toe. You see, you add, food is not just food here. It's memory. When you taste a date, you taste all the stories of your people, the caravans that carried sacks of them across empires, the palms planted beside wells, the hands that shared them during long journeys. You lower your voice, leaning in like you're sharing a secret. There is even a fringe tale that dates where the first fruit taught to humans by jinn. Supposedly, a desert spirit whispered how to plant palms, promising that no one would starve as long as the trees stood. Historians dismiss this as myth, of course, but tell me, do you know anyone who can resist a date? The merchants grin sheepishly, chewing as though caught in the act. The children's eyes widen, imagining jinn crouched beneath palm groves, whispering into human ears. You recline slightly, looking toward the horizon where the air shimmers like molten glass. Food teaches us patience. Think about bread in the city puffed up and ready in hours. Out here, we wait for palms to grow, for fruit to ripen, for the well to yield water. The desert teaches you that a meal is a story stretched across seasons. You can't rush it. And maybe that's why stories taste better when told with sticky fingers. You pause long enough to let the laughter settle, then drift into a factual aside. Caravans carried sacks of dried dates across the Red Sea, into Persia, even to India. They were currency, medicine, and dessert. Doctors in Baghdad swore dates cured fatigue, though I suspect they just liked eating them on the job. And you point playfully at one listener, wouldn't survive long without them. No offense. The circle chuckles, shaking their heads at the familiar refrain. The children ask for another food story, and you oblige with one about milk, sweetened by a splash of honey. You describe a shepherd so absent-minded he forgot to drink from his bowl, only to discover it had turned into yogurt by morning. He thought he'd been cursed, you say with mock seriousness, but after tasting it, he thanked the spirits for their generosity. That's how yogurt was born, or so I heard. The circle laughs again, some skeptical, others nodding as if this sounds perfectly reasonable. Historians still debate whether Bedouins discovered fermented milk by accident or design. You shrug theatrically, choosing to leave it as an open puzzle. Perhaps the desert wanted us to learn patience yet again. Leave milk too long, and it becomes something new. Maybe that's the desert's joke. Spoilage as a gift. The parents begin telling the children to wipe their sticky fingers while you continue weaving details into the air. Food also teaches generosity. A tent without dates and milk is a silent tent. But when you offer a stranger your last handful, suddenly the walls stretch wider. Hospitality here isn't just custom, it's survival disguised as kindness. Because if you share today, perhaps someone will share with you tomorrow. And if no one shares, well, you'll be left chewing on your sandal straps, which I don't recommend. The laughter is immediate, though one child insists he might try. A breeze ripples through, scattering fine sand across the mats. You brush your cushion lightly, letting the movement become part of the rhythm of your voice. Of course, every food carries a shadow too. Too many dates can give you a stomachache. Too much milk in the heat can sour quickly. The desert offers abundance, but always with a reminder not to be greedy. Moderation, there's the secret recipe. The merchants nod knowingly, while one of the parents murmurs about how even water can be dangerous if drunk too quickly after thirst. You echo it aloud. Yes, even water can betray you if you don't respect it. The dessert doesn't punish, it educates. Sometimes with kindness, sometimes with cramps. That earns a laugh, though a cautious one. You lean back, stretching, letting your gaze roam over the horizon where the heat waves ripple like ghosts. Remember this when you travel. Every meal is a story. Every bite is history on your tongue. That's why storytellers like me season our tales with food. It keeps the belly full and the ears open. Without food, words turn to dust. The children, growing drowsy now, slump against their parents. A camel snorts in the background, unimpressed by all this talk of sticky fruit. You glance at the animal and grin. Ah, yes, camels. They'd never trade their thorny bushes for our sweets. But give them a date once in a while and watch their eyes light up. Even they can't resist a little sugar. As laughter fades, the air stills again. You let your voice soften, preparing the circle for rest. Food fills the belly, but stories fill the night. And tomorrow, when you bite into another date, maybe you'll wonder, did a djinn slip this into my pouch? Or is it just the desert feeding me one more tale? The listeners smile faintly, licking their fingers, folding the mats. They rise slowly, leaving you beneath the acacia's stretching shadow. Alone for a moment, you pluck one last date from the bowl and chew it thoughtfully. The taste is sweet, yes, but sweeter still is the silence it leaves behind, thick with stories not yet told. The afternoon drifts toward evening, and the desert air changes character. The heat softens, as if finally deciding to give everyone a break, and a breath of coolness slides in from the horizon. You rise slowly, brushing sand from your robe, and notice how the merchants begin rearranging their bundles, preparing for the long night of travel. The parents gather the children, settling them into small nests of blankets near the camels. And you ready yourself for the shift from daylight stories to firelit ones. You crouch near a circle of stones, stacking twigs and dried brush. The desert teaches efficiency. Too much wood, and the flames grow unruly. Too little, and the night feels colder than it should. You strike flint, coaxing a spark into a glow, and soon the fire breathes, snapping cheerfully. The circle reforms as though drawn by gravity, faces glowing orange, eyes glittering like the stars that are just beginning to wink awake above. Now, you say, rubbing your hands near the flames, this is when stories truly stretch their legs. Daytime tales are short and sweet, but night is when the desert leans close and whispers all its secrets. The children lean in automatically, while the merchants exchange satisfied looks. You toss a twig into the fire. Let's start with the obvious. This fire isn't just for warmth or cooking. It's a lighthouse in a sea of darkness. You'll see travelers miles away, drawn like moths. Some bring friendship, others trouble. Historians still argue whether Bedouin fires were invitations or warnings. Or beware, we are already gathered. You smirk, letting the ambiguity hang. The flames crackle, throwing sparks skyward, and you lower your voice. But fires don't only attract humans. Spirits, too, wander toward the glow. Or so the old ones say. You lean in suddenly, making the nearest child flinch. That's why you never leave a fire unattended. You think you're saving wood, but really, you're leaving a doorway wide open. The circle shivers, though the merchants quickly hide their unease behind smirks. You add, softening the tension, of course, sometimes spirits just want to warm their toes. Don't worry too much, just don't offer them tea, or you'll never get rid of them. The group chuckles, relief rippling through. The fire pops loudly, punctuating your words. Yes, you seize the moment. There's a story I know, you begin, about a traveler who fell asleep by his fire. When he awoke, he found an extra log burning, one he hadn't placed. He swore a stranger had visited in the night, leaving fuel instead of stealing it. Was it a kind spirit, a wandering friend, or just his bad memory? Historians still debate whether this was folklore or a cautionary tale about keeping track of your supplies. I say it was generosity wearing a cloak of mystery. The children's eyes widen, imagining unseen guests stoking their campfires. You grin. So next time you wake to a bigger fire than you left, don't panic. Just say thank you and move on. No sense offending a helpful ghost. You poke the embers, sending sparks spiraling upward like miniature constellations. Do you see? Fire doesn't just burn wood, it burns time. Each spark is a second you'll never get back, floating away into the night. That's why storytellers love fire. It teaches patience. You can't rush a flame any more than you can rush a tale. Both need air, space, and just enough fuel to keep breathing. One of the merchants nods, muttering about how fires at caravan stops were rationed carefully, each spark accounted for. You expand on the thought. In fact, Bedouins used fire to send signals. A fire on a dune could warn of raiders or mark the path to an oasis. Imagine your survival could hinge on whether someone spotted a flicker against the horizon. Even today, you see satellites twinkle above, but out here, we had our own messages in flame. You glance at the children, lowering your voice again. But not every fire is safe. Too big, and the desert takes notice. They say dunes shift to smother greedy flames, or that winds rise to scatter sparks. So they want to eat more than they re-given. Historians call this superstition. I call it respect. If the desert doesn't like your fire, it'll let you know. The circle nods, solemn now, the playful mood tempered. You lighten it with a grin. And besides, if you've ever tried to cook flatbread on a fire too hot, you'll understand why moderation matters. Burnt bread is punishment enough. Trust me. Laughter returns, the parents shaking their heads knowingly. A child asks, timidly, whether fire can talk. You consider this carefully. Yes, you say softly. Not with words, but with crackles and sighs. Listen closely, and you'll hear it gossiping. Some say every pop is a memory escaping from the wood, a life lived long ago, a tree telling its last story. That's why storytellers like me love to speak beside it, two voices weaving together. One of flame, one of flesh. The merchants exchange intrigued looks, clearly charmed by the thought. You take another sip of tea, now smoky from the fire. And fire, you continue, isn't just about warmth or warning, it's community. Without it, our circle would scatter. With it, we're bound together, shadows touching, stories shared. Without fire, there is no storyteller. Only silence and sand. Historians still argue whether fire rituals in Bedouin life were symbolic or purely practical. You wave your hand dismissively. Symbolic, practical. Why separate them? Every spark is both. You warm your hands, and you remember your ancestors. You cook your bread, and you teach your children not to fear the dark. Fire doesn't choose one role. It plays them all. The flames settle lower, glowing red rather than leaping high. The children lean against their parents, eyes half closed but unwilling to leave the circle just yet. You soften your voice. You think of fire as a storyteller's twin. Both begin smaller, spark, or a word. Both grow with care, fueled by breath and attention. And if ignored, both die quietly, leaving only smoke behind. So when you feed the fire, remember you're also feeding the tale. You pause, letting the hush settle. The only sounds are the faint crackle of wood and the rustle of desert wind. You could end here, but the circle waits, expectant. So you add one more twist. Of course, there's a final warning. Never blow out a fire with your breath. The old one said it insults the flame, sends it into the world angry. Always let it die gently, smothered with sand, or leave it with enough wood to fade naturally. Otherwise, you lower your voice. You might find your next story cut short. The circle laughs nervously, though a few glance at the fire with new caution. You smile, satisfied. The night has stretched open, the stars now shining fully above, and your fire burns steady at the center of it all. You lean back, folding your arms, letting the warmth seep into your skin. Around you, faces glow, shadows dance, and the desert itself seems to lean closer, listening. The fire burns low now, embers glowing like patient eyes. And you feel the circle leaning into the darker kind of storytelling, the tales that travel in whispers, carried more by breath than by voice. You let the silence draw tight before you break it. You lower your tone further, almost conspiratorial. Out there, you point into the darkness, lie the bones of places swallowed by time. Cities that once bustled with markets, laughter, even fountains, now buried beneath dunes. Historians still argue whether some were real or only legends, but the desert keeps her secrets well. The merchants exchange glances. They know the truth of half-swallowed caravanserais, places where you might stumble on a fragment of wall or a cracked pot before the sand reclaims it again. You add, sometimes travelers find shards of pottery miles from any settlement. A cup lying alone in the sand, far from where it belonged. Who carried it? Who lost it? And why did the desert decide to reveal it today? You pause, letting them imagine. Then you lean closer to the fire, eyes glinting. There's one story, you say slowly, of Uber, the lost city some call Iram of the Pillars. Supposedly it was rich, with towers reaching so high they scraped the sky. But greed filled its streets and arrogance poisoned its wells. The desert grew tired of their pride. One morning, caravans approached, only to find empty land. The city had vanished overnight, swallowed whole. The children gasp. One merchant shakes his head, muttering skeptically, but the parents hush him. Skepticism spoils the fun. Historians still debate. You add, whether Uber ever existed. Some say it's nothing but myth, stitched together from the ruins of lesser towns. Others insist satellite images show hints of caravan trails leading to a collapsed site in Oman. Me, I say the desert erased it for a reason, and who are we to pry? The fire pops, sending sparks into the air. You seize the moment, voice soft as sand sliding through fingers. And sometimes, when a sandstorm rages, they say you can hear faint market cries in the wind, the echo of Uber's last morning. A warning to any who grow too proud beneath the sky. The circle falls into silence. The merchants glance uneasily at the horizon, as though expecting towers to rise in the distance. The children snuggle closer to their parents, wide-eyed. You smile faintly, letting the weight of the tale settle before shifting to something lighter. Of course, not every ruin holds curses, you say. Some hide treasures. I once heard of a shepherd who found a slab of stone, etched with lines he couldn't read. He used it as a step at his tent's entrance, wiping his sandals on it daily. Years later, a scholar saw it and nearly fainted. It was a piece of an ancient script, worth more than the shepherd's entire herd. He shrugged and said, "Well, it made a fine step." The group bursts into laughter, tension melting. You add the quirky tidbit that's always a crowd pleaser. Some travelers swear that half-buried ruins glow faintly at night, as though the stones themselves remember firelight. Historians dismiss it as reflected starlight or bioluminescent fungi. But I prefer the idea that old walls don't like being forgotten. The children beg for another ruined story, and you give them one about a collapsed well said to be haunted by a jinn who once guarded its water. He grew bored when no one came to drink anymore. You explain, so now he sulks in the depths, waiting for travelers to drop pebbles so he has something to count. The children laugh, promising to toss stones if they ever pass such a well. You stretch, warming your hands near the embers. Every ruin tells you two things, you say softly. 1. Nothing lasts forever. 2. Even when it's gone, it leaves whispers. The desert is full of whispers if you learn to listen. Historians still argue whether ruins shaped Bedouin storytelling, or whether storytelling shaped the memory of ruins. You shrugged theatrically. Probably both. What good is a crumbling wall if no one spins a tale around it? What good is a story if it has no stone to anchor itself? You glance upward at the stars that look brighter against the dark backdrop. Think of it this way, you continue. The ruins are the bones of the desert, the stars are its eyes, and we sitting here telling tales are its heartbeat. The embers are low now, faint pulses of orange trembling against the black sand, as if the fire is reluctant to die before your voice has finished its wandering. A cold wind lifts from the west, carrying the sharp tang of dry stone, and the listeners huddle deeper into their cloaks. The night has grown long, but no one asks for sleep. Their eyes are still pinned on you, waiting. You shift your weight on the rug beneath you, fingers brushing over the weave, then speak slowly. Stories live, but they do not live alone. They need breath, they need ears, they need a circle. A storyteller without listeners is like a flute buried in sand. It might still exist, but it cannot sing. The children smile faintly, their chins resting on their hands. One merchant rubs at his tired eyes but does not look away. You draw the thread tighter. In the desert, people gathered differently than they do in cities. There was no theater, no marble stage, no carved chairs. The stage was the sand itself, the roof a dome of stars, the walls the arc of the horizon, and the audience whoever was near. Shepherds returning late. Traders too weary to sleep. Even strangers whose names you would never learn. The desert decided who shared a fire. You let the idea rest in the air, then continue with a wry smile. Of course, sometimes the audience was less than ideal. Camels groaning in the background, someone coughing through the best part of a joke, or a sandstorm sweeping in just when the tale reached its climax. Nothing kills suspense faster than grit in your teeth. The circle laughs softly, releasing the tension of the cold air. You nod, but when it worked, when the fire was steady, when the stars shone clear, when people leaned in and forgot the weight of the DA. That was when stories became more than stories. They became warmth itself. You tilt your head toward the merchants. Even explorers wrote about this. In their journals, they confessed that the desert night was cruel, almost unbearable till someone began to tell a tale. Then the cold lessened, the wind seemed to soften, and time flowed differently. Historians still argue whether this was exaggeration or fact. But anyone who has sat by a fire like this knows how words can change the air itself. A child yawns but still stares at you, refusing to miss a syllable. You grin. Sometimes the best audience was made of children. They asked questions that kept the story alive, pulling details from you like threads unraveling from a cloth. Adults listened politely, but children demanded. They wanted to know what color the giant's beard was, or how many steps it took the lost caravan to cross the impossible dune. They refused to let you skip. And because of that, stories grew richer. You pause, your voice dropping into a conspiratorial hush. But there was danger too. A bad audience could ruin a story as quickly as a storm. There are tales of storytellers silenced because their words stirred old grudges or mocked the wrong family. Once, so the rumor goes, a man told a story about a greedy merchant who cheated his companions. Everyone laughed, except one listener, who saw himself in the tale. The next morning, the storyteller's tent was gone, and no one asked questions. Historians still argue whether such vanishings were real or just warnings told to keep storytellers cautious. But you can imagine why some of us walked carefully around our words. The listeners nod, sober now, and you let the weight sink in. Then you lighten it with a chuckle. On the other hand, there were nights when the audience carried you higher than you deserved. I remember a tale of a man who repeated the same story 3 times in a single evening because the crowd kept demanding it again. They knew every word, every twist, but they begged to hear it once more. He obliged. Of course, though, by the 3rd time, he'd added a camel that danced and a goat that could argue about taxes. They laughed harder than ever. That is the gift of a generous audience. They make even old words shine. The circle chuckles, imagining the goat. One merchant mutters that a goat might argue better than some tax collectors he's met. You stretch your legs, the sand shifting softly beneath your feet. Audiences didn't just listen, they shaped the stories. A raised eyebrow here, a gasp there, a sigh at the right moment, Those were like instruments a storyteller played. Without them, the melody faltered. And so, when people say a tale is the work of one voice, they forget the truth. It is a conversation, even when only one person speaks. Every silence, every laugh, every shared glance, those are part of the story too. You point lightly at the group. You may not know it, but tonight you are shaping this very tale. The way you lean forward, the way you laugh, even the way your eyelids droop ease. You, young one, those are threads I weave. Without you, my words would float away like smoke. With you, they settle, they root. The children glow with pride, suddenly aware they are part of something alive. You let the thought stretch into calm. In the old days, audiences sometimes gave gifts to storytellers. Not coins, though coins were welcome but tokens. A bead, a piece of cloth, a scrap of bone. These were placed at the edge of the fire as offerings, as if to say, "Your words warmed us, let us warm you." Some storytellers kept boxes full of these little gifts, treasures not for value, but for memory. Open the box, and each token whispered a night, a circle, a set of faces leaning close. You sigh softly, almost wistfully. Imagine if we could carry such boxes for our whole lives. Every listener, every shared breath, tucked away like a pebble. By the end, the box would rattle like a drum with all the lives we touched. The group falls quiet, the thoughts sinking into them. The fire crackles faintly, sparks spiraling upward like tiny souls. You bring the section to a close with gentleness. So remember, when you listen tonight, you are not passive. You are part of the story itself. Without your ears, my words fall. Without your eyes, my images fade. Without your silence, my pauses collapse. You are not an audience. You are co-creators. And that, perhaps, is the desert's greatest secret. She does not tell her stories alone. She tells them through us, and through you. The cold presses in harder now, the fire nearly gone, yet the listeners lean closer still. You wrap your cloak tighter, and your voice becomes the only warmth left. The fire is nearly ash now, a faint glow hiding in the cinders, like the last ember of a dream that refuses to end. The desert stretches around you in silence, vast and ancient, as if it too has leaned in to hear what you'll say next. The listeners pull their blankets tighter, eyes glossy in the starlight. And you know this is the moment for quieter truths, the way storytellers themselves are remembered, or sometimes forgotten. You clear your throat gently. Audiences fade, fires die. But what happens to the storyteller? Do our names walk on, or do they sink beneath the sand? Your voice is low, coaxing, almost like a lullaby. A child frowns. People remember, they whisper. You smile. Some do, but not always. You explain how in the 19th century, many Bedouin storytellers left almost nothing written behind. The desert valued the spoken word, not the written one. Ink could spill, parchment could burn, but a voice lived only in the ears of those who heard it. And when those ears closed, when memory faltered, sometimes a whole life of stories vanished. Historians still argue whether this was loss or liberation. You add, was it tragedy that voices disappeared like smoke? Or was it beautiful, that stories lived only in the moment they were told, like sparks flying into the night? The merchants nod thoughtfully, weighing this. You glance up at the sky. Some storytellers did pass their words to scribes. You'll find fragments in dusty libraries, parables about foxes and lions, cautionary tales of greedy chiefs, but names. Rarely the stories are there, stripped of their voices, their pauses, their laughter. It's like finding bones without flesh. You can study them, but they do not breathe. The group listens, silent. A jackal calls in the distance, a sharp sound swallowed quickly by the desert. You lean closer, voice dipping into a playful edge. Yet some storytellers carve themselves into memory, whether by skill, by luck, or by sheer stubbornness. There was one al-Rashid of the Three Roads who was said to have memorized not only tales, but the very genealogies of tribes. People called him a living archive. He could tell you who begot whom for 10 generations, then slip seamlessly into a fable about a donkey who outwitted a vizier. Was he real? Historians still argue, of course. But travelers swore his words were worth more than gold because memory is wealth in the desert. A merchant laughed softly. If memory is wealth, I am the poorest man alive. You grin. Ah, but you remember my stories, don't you? That makes you rich. The children giggle, nudging the merchant, who rolls his eyes but smiles. You continue, softer again. There were storytellers who became ghosts in their own lifetime wandering so far, telling so many tales that no one knew where they came from. They were welcomed in Damascus, in Cairo, in Aleppo, yet nowhere were they rooted. Some say they chose this to be children of no tribe, so they could speak freely without fear of offending. Others whisper they were outcasts, carrying stories because they carried nothing else. Perhaps both. The desert does not care about your origin, only whether your words can keep her awake. A hush drapes over the group. The fire collapses inward, leaving a curl of smoke. You continue in that quiet. Sometimes, a storyteller's name survived not in books, not in fame, but in the memories of those they healed. A woman whose grief softened after a night of listening. A boy who found courage to face the caravan's hardships because of a tale of heroes. Those names are invisible, unrecorded, yet they echo in bloodlines, in whispered bedtime retellings, in the small bravery of everyday life. Perhaps that is immortality enough. The merchants glance at each other as though weighing which storytellers have shaped them without their knowing. Then you let a mischievous grin slip back. And yet, some storytellers tried to cheat oblivion. They boasted so loudly of their own greatness that people remembered them simply to laugh. One man in Busra reportedly declared, "When I die, even the camels will mourn." Sure enough, at his funeral, a camel broke free and caused havoc in the market. People joked for years that even the beasts honored his claim. Coincidence? Or the desert's peculiar sense of humor? The group chuckles, shaking off the heaviness. But you guide them gently back into quiet. Here is the truth. Storytellers vanish, as all do. Their bones return to the sand, their voices to the wind. But the words the words walk on. Sometimes they change clothes, wearing new names, new settings. A tale told by a Bedouin in the 1800s might wander into Europe, appear in a children's book, or whisper itself into a bedtime story far away. The desert does not mind. She lends her stories to whoever listens. What matters is not the teller, but the telling. You pause, watching the stars flicker. The silence is thick, heavy with thought. You let it sit, then soften your voice to a near whisper. So perhaps we should not ask whether storytellers are remembered. We should ask whether the people listening remember themselves within the stories. Do you see your own face in the tale of the wandering caravan? Do you hear your own heart in the fox who tricks the lion? If you do, then the storyteller lives on not in fame, but in you. The children glance at each other, then at their parents, unsure but comforted by your tone. The merchants sigh, shoulders dropping, as though they've set something heavy down. You smile, almost tenderly. I tell you this not to make you sad, but to remind you every story is already a kind of remembrance. Tonight, as we sit here, you have carried me into your memory. Tomorrow, when you walk the dunes, you may recall one phrase, one image. That is enough. I live in you, and you live in me. The desert could not ask for more. A final gust of wind scatters the ashes, carrying the last warmth away. The circle draws closer, not for heat now, but for nearness. And you let your voice linger just above a whisper, like a promise. Perhaps that is how all storytellers are remembered, by statues, not by pages, but by the quiet spaces they fill in your own heart. As long as you breathe their words once more, they do not die. The silence afterward feels complete, as though even the desert has bowed her head.